All right, welcome back to the FITSNews studio, another edition of your Week in Review. We are diving back in with the Becky Hill saga. We've got a big update on the status of the criminal investigations into Becky Hill. And yes, we're using that term for the first time based on a big announcement that was exclusively reported by FITSNews. We're going to walk you through that and all the latest news on the upcoming evidentiary hearing on whether Alec Murdaugh will get a new trial based on those allegations against Becky Hill. FITSNews was also at the South Carolina State House this week, stirring the pot, and we broke a big story that really turned the State House upside down this past week, involving establishment politicians seeking to control the narrative over any dissenters. We're going to walk you through what they're trying to do and what we did to stand in the gap. Last but not least, Dylan Nolan and I are going to sit down and walk you through the presidential primary election. The time for talking, folks, it's almost over. We are about to see the first votes cast. Dylan and I are going to walk you through what's happening in Iowa and how it could impact not only what happens then in New Hampshire, but coming back home to first in the South, South Carolina, the state that picks presidents. We're going to take you through all the latest presidential political details. Finally, on our way out of the show, we're going to tease a big interview that we're dropping next week. You won't believe who came into this studio this week and spoke with me about the subject of judicial reform. All of that and more heading your way on the Week in Review. So as we approach the big evidentiary hearing as Alec Murdaugh seeks a new trial, obviously big news this week, the South Carolina State Law Enforcement Division confirming not one, but two criminal investigations into Colleton County Clerk of Court Becky Hill. Now, the first investigation, obviously, those of us who've been following the story for any period of time already knew about the investigation into the jury tampering allegations, although it is significant that SLED is now confirming that investigation in the context of Becky Hill, which, I don't know, some would say that could lend credence to the allegation that serious enough for SLED to investigate criminally. They don't just do that for no reason. But also, SLED confirming that they are investigating Becky Hill for allegations that she abused her public office for personal gain. Now, we've heard a lot about this before. Again, our news outlet exclusively reported last month that Becky Hill was the focus of two ethics complaints, one of them regarding her book, Behind the Doors of Justice, alleging that excerpts from that book, that photographs that were disseminated with that book, materials and accounts from that book were obtained by Becky Hill in the furtherance of her duties as clerk of court, and that was information not available to others that she is now profiting from personally as a result of her position. The second complaint alleging that Becky Hill misappropriated public funds and then lied to county officials about those alleged misappropriations. So a lot of this stuff we've been reporting on, folks have called it fake news. They accused us of unfairly maligning Becky Hill, who, again, was someone all of us really got to know and love during that Murdaugh murders, crime and corruption main event down there in Walterboro last year, the double homicide trial. But again, a lot of folks challenging those reports. But then last month, you'll recall, we reported on Becky Hill's response to the ethics allegations, which has since been verified as authentic. So again, some of those folks at that point were like, well, wait a minute, there's something to this. But now, SLED confirming a criminal investigation into Becky Hill. So things continue to escalate. But I also want to go back to the story that we published last week, the big story about the phones, the allegations of obstruction of justice, because as we move closer to the Murdaugh evidentiary hearing, all of this is starting to gather momentum, to gather into a huge sort of head of steam as we approach this big hearing. And the question is going to be, how is Becky Hill going to handle it? Now, we spoke last week with Lauren Turner, an attorney out of the upstate. Lauren's going to be coming back on soon. We're going to have her on some panels as we move closer to this big evidentiary hearing for Murdaugh's retrial. But Lauren made a point. We asked her about, hey, if you were advising Becky Hill, would you tell her to take the fifth? Lauren said no. She said that Becky Hill's best bet would be to just lay it all out, lay all the cards on the table. And we spoke this week with another attorney, Bill Young, who's from Walterboro, South Carolina. His dad, actually the mayor down there in Walterboro, the John Grisham lookalike, if you remember the coverage from the trial. But Bill Young said the same thing. And the argument that we're starting to see percolate a bit here as we head into this hearing is that Becky Hill taking the Fifth Amendment, if she indeed decides to do that, could be very damaging to the state of South Carolina's case. Now, as we consider whether or not Becky Hill will take the Fifth, plead the Fifth, assert her right not to incriminate herself, there are a lot of layers to this discussion. And one of the things in our discussion with Bill Young that I thought was very interesting, he really broke down sort of the details of that, the implications of that. And let's cut to that segment of the interview because I thought it was very enlightening.
Ordinarily, let's talk about this in a broader point first, and then we'll come back. So ordinarily, in a criminal trial, of course, the defendant has the right to not testify. The jury is instructed not to take a negative or positive inference from that. Okay? In a civil trial, you do not get that same benefit of the doubt. So in a civil trial, if someone gets on the stand and pleads the fifth on a question or two or however many, the judge will instruct the jury that they can take an adverse inference to that. In other words, that if the person had answered the question truthfully, that it would have been negative to them and that it likely would have implicated them in some sort of criminal matter. What we're talking about here is not a mix of those because we're still in a criminal proceeding, but we don't have a jury. We've got Chief Justice Toll, who is likely going to take all of the information provided. You know, there were matters raised in the defense memo this morning saying they would object to certain questions being asked. I foresee both sides making objections and Chief Justice Toll overruling them all. She's going to take the information, and then she can decide what she wants to use or not. So in the instance of if the clerk gets on the stand, if she's called to testify and she takes the fifth, you know, I think the natural inclination that Chief Justice Toll would have from that is she was going to draw a negative inference from it, as would most people, I believe.
So as we think about Chief Justice Toll and potentially limiting Becky Hill's testimony, though, is there any world in which she allows Becky Hill to invoke the Fifth Amendment in response to certain questions, yet affirmatively deny her jury tampering in other questions? I mean, doesn't that erode the defense's ability to impeach her credibility?
Well, I think that the fact that Ms. Hill submitted the affidavit to rebut what was said about her by other people, I don't believe that's going to constitute a waiver of her Fifth Amendment rights when it comes to testifying. If she's subpoenaed, which we all assume she will be, and called to testify, at that point she will have to decide whether she is going to answer questions or invoke her Fifth Amendment. If she starts answering questions, I think she's going to be compelled to continue answering questions.
What's the remedy if she doesn't?
She would likely be held in contempt of court.
And could they strike the entire testimony if she selectively invoked the Fifth?
So they could do that. The court could order her to answer the questions. You know, there is a potential coercive effect of contempt, which is, you see this a lot of times with media where they might refuse to divulge sources and the media member is placed in jail until they agree to provide the source. That could potentially be a method. I'm not suggesting that it's going to be, but that is in the quiver of remedies available. In all likelihood, if the clerk started answering questions and then refused to answer others after being instructed multiple times by the Chief Justice to answer the questions, Chief Justice would probably simply strike her testimony.
And in that event, the state's got a tough road to hoe. So obviously we're looking at the big question of whether or not Becky Hill will plead the Fifth, take the Fifth, assert her right not to incriminate herself, or won't she? And what are the implications of that? Obviously, we're going to find out a lot more about that next week. A big status conference is scheduled for the 16th of January, this coming Tuesday at the Richland County Courthouse. Justice Toll presiding. We will be there, live feed, live stream, updating you constantly on what's happening at that key hearing where we're going to see some of the ground rules laid for this hearing about how juror testimony is going to be handled, who's going to be allowed to be in the courtroom, which testimony will be heard in open court, who's going to be doing the questioning. A lot of questions left to be resolved. We're going to take you through all those at this big status conference. And one thing I do want to point out, both the defense and the state filed briefs ahead of this big hearing next Tuesday. Only the defense brief is public, however. We have been checking that website repeatedly, the Supreme Court posting all this online, but no filing yet posted by the state. We're told they have filed one, but that there's potentially juror information in there that they do not want out. We may not get a look at that state filing until the day of the big hearing on Tuesday. But again, count on FITSNews. We've got a Murdaugh murders jury tampering hearing landing page on our website, FITSNews.com. There you can read all of our stories, access all of our video coverage of this, and more importantly, you can read all of the documents related to this case for yourself so you can see the source material that we're using as we report on it. But again, FITSNews has been the tip of the spear on this story from the very beginning. Count on us to keep you up to speed on the very latest as we approach the first big day of decision in Alec Murdaugh's bid for a new trial. All right, so this past Tuesday, in fact, was the first day of the 2024 session of the South Carolina General Assembly, a group that has been voted the most liberal Republican legislature in the country for 3 years running. And this is the Republican supermajority, again, you'll recall, that kicked out its conservative members last year. That's right. These 16 lawmakers refused to sign a loyalty oath vowing to support the establishment candidates in primary elections, and so they were kicked out of their own party. Imagine that, the handful of lawmakers who are actually trying to make the Republican Party act like Republicans were thrown out of the Republican Party. I guess that's the new uniparty lay of the land in the Palmetto State. But this week, as the lawmakers returned to Columbia for a session that's being held in a pivotal election year, we saw the establishment Republicans strike again. Not content with throwing these conservative members out of the party, they now want to limit their ability to influence debate. I want to walk you through this because this is a big deal, and this ended up being the big story of the week, a week that Republican leadership thought they were going to score some points on some social issues. Well, guess again. The real story this week was another effort by the Republican leadership who are controlled by special interests, who are not representing, again, those core Republican ideals, to silence the conservative minority in the South Carolina legislature. Now, here's what they did. They passed a rule that basically forbids individual lawmakers from introducing amendments on bills. Now, they can still draft these amendments, but under this new rule, it will be up to the majority leader and the minority leader, who's a Democrat, by the way, to introduce a total of 14 amendments. That's going to be the limit on amendments for each bill. Now, here's the problem. The establishment leaders are the ones picking them. No amendment can be introduced without their approval, and any amendment that they don't choose, guess what? It's in the trash. It's not even debated. In other words, the conservative wing of the GOP has absolutely no power to try to frame these bills in ways that are better for citizens, better for taxpayers, and producing better outcomes for our state. Now, let me walk you through all the ways that this is terrible. First of all, they divided the amendments, the allowable amendments, the status quo approved amendments, equally between the Republican majority and the Democratic minority. Now, why is this a little odd? Well, Republicans have a super majority in the South Carolina House. They control more than 88 seats, nearly 90 seats. Democrats have 35 seats. So why are we granting equal authority over the rules of debate to both parties? Here was my point. If Democrats want more influence over the rules of debate, they should win a few more elections. But that's not the real danger of this rules change. The real danger is that it silences, again, that group of Republican lawmakers who are trying to get the GOP to live up to its stated principles: limited government, lower taxes, less spending, more individual liberty. It is silencing those lawmakers by refusing to allow them to introduce amendments to these bills. Now, this proposal was pushed through a Rules Committee on the very first day of the legislative session. The very first day that Rules Committee met, they pushed this proposal through. And they were supposed to introduce it on the floor of the House. But guess what? Thanks to grassroots conservatives from across the state rallying, calling their lawmakers, the leadership pulled that rules change. They did not introduce it. Now, we don't know if they're going to try to push it through again next week or the week after that. For now, though, they have thought twice about rolling out this again. Totally anti-democratic, anti-representative, unfair rules change. Now, once again, it was FITSNews.com that first reported on this. Just like last year, we were the first ones to report on the loyalty oath and the conservative members getting kicked out of the GOP. This year, we were the first to report on this. And once again, it was our coverage that helped sort of generate some of that grassroots angst that has got the rules change, temporarily anyway, on hold. But I want to let everybody out there know, we tag that as a litmus test vote. Any Republican, any lawmaker who endorses this rules change aimed at short-circuiting the voice of the people, guess what? We're going to oppose you in the next election. We're going to encourage folks to run against you and to beat you in the primary elections this spring. Count on FITSNews again to keep you up to speed on the very latest of what's happening at the State House and to tell you the stories the mainstream media won't tell. So the time for talk is over in presidential politics. It is time for the first votes to be cast. We're now just days away from the Iowa Republican caucuses, the first in the nation caucuses, which are held every 4 years. Get the party started. We then go to New Hampshire, and then after that, February 24, the show will be coming here to South Carolina, the first in the South presidential primary, scheduled for February 24th of this year. I'm joined by Dylan Nolan, our special project director, our producer. Dylan, we've been talking about this race for so long. We're finally to the point now where some of these predictions we've been making, they're going to be put to the test. And I wanted to start off with a question about the polls in this race. We're looking at Iowa, obviously. There's national polling showing one thing. There's other early state polling, swing state polling. None of that really matters right now. What matters right now is the polling in Iowa, which is where that first true test of these candidates is taking place. Right now, we've got Donald Trump with a huge lead, commanding lead, 53 to 52%, depending on what index you're looking at. And behind him, for the first time now, Nikki Haley polling at around 17%, a little better in some surveys, a little lower in others, and DeSantis nipping on her heels roughly in that 15% range. Do you think the polls are going to get it right in Iowa? And I want to ask you particularly, do you think they're going to get it right on the fourth place candidate, Vivek Ramaswamy?
You know, it's interesting. I don't know if you've looked at the weather recently, but we are expecting some major snowfall in Iowa. So I think the candidates that have the most emphatic supporters maybe are going to do better. And I think that probably is going to help Vivek just because he tacks pretty hard ideologically. I think that his supporters might be a little more motivated to get in their cars than, kind of moderate, middle of the road ticket voting Republicans. So we'll see if that pans out. Now, we saw in 2016, we saw in 2020, polls don't always mean a lot. The red wave that wasn't, Hillary Clinton. So obviously we got to wait for the rubber to meet the road. But I think that one thing's for sure, it's going to be a heck of an upset if Donald Trump doesn't take the day in Iowa.
Right, and I don't think anyone's envisioning a scenario where Trump loses Iowa. I think the big question, at least that the mainstream media has been pushing as they advance the candidacy of Nikki Haley pretty transparently, we'll say, and we're going to get into that in just a minute. We'll talk about her as the potential Trojan horse. But the real question, as I see in Iowa, is what does Nikki Haley do? If she finishes second, obviously that's better than expected. If she finishes a strong second, that could position her for momentum in New Hampshire.
Right, and Christie just dropped out of the race this week. I'm sure that was something you wanted to talk about. That obviously opens up a big lane for Nikki Haley, but Christie doesn't think it's enough.
Yeah, let's actually talk about that because the expectation, we had actually talked about it in the office this week about whether Christie's candidacy was designed at this point to hurt Trump, the guy he's been bashing relentlessly and rabidly ever since he got in the race, or was it at this point really hurting Haley? Because again, most of his supporters will likely fall to her in Iowa, New Hampshire. And so let me ask you this question. We've got this clip, and I wanted to play this clip. This is Christie on a hot mic at one of his own events in New Hampshire shortly before he drops out of the race, where he says what he really thinks about Nikki Haley. Let's take a listen to this clip.
People don't want to hear it, Wayne. Mm-hmm. They don't want to hear it. We know we're right, but they don't want to hear it.
Right.
And there's, we couldn't have been any clearer
Right.
We couldn't have been any more direct or worked any harder. So,
And let's not forget she spent $68 million.
Yeah.
I mean, we spent like.
Well, when you give land to China and places like that.
yeah, that's what you get.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, she spent $68 million so far, just on TV. Spent $68 million so far, $59 million by DeSantis, and we spent 12. I mean, who's punching above their weight and who's getting a return on their investment, you know? And she's going to get smoked, and you and I both know it. She's not up to this.
She hasn't even been.
And she's still 20 points behind Trump in New Hampshire, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And he's still going to carry Iowa, right?
Yes. Oh, I talked to DeSantis called me, petrified that I would.
He's probably getting out after Iowa.
Well,
She's not up for it, Dylan.
And what really caught my ears, they spent a lot of money. Both Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley have dumped a lot of money onto the TV airwaves.
So not even a joke about Chris Christie and the punching above the weight class there?
Well, I was going to say he's never known for keeping his mouth shut, but he can do that one too.
Dylan Nolan, our resident fat shamer of Chris Christie.
It's just Chris. Fat folks in the audience, I don't have a problem with y'all.
Well, let's ask them now. If you're, and again, I know your birthday was yesterday, and you're probably, West Wing was 2 years before you were born. So this reference may date you, but the hot mic, Jed Bartlett, where he literally intentionally delivers a hot mic so that he can call into question his opponent's intelligence. Did Chris Christie not know what he was doing here?
You know, it's really hard to read Chris Christie. I mean, if you remember a couple years back, he was campaigning with Donald Trump. Now he's on a crusade against Donald Trump. And then a day later, you hear him on a hot mic doing things that would help Donald Trump. So as much as I like to make guesses about what's going to happen politically, I don't pretend to know what's going on inside of the mind of Chris Christie.
The problem, obviously, is were he to endorse Nikki Haley in New Hampshire, which I think most people would agree would be a big bump for her that could potentially put her in striking distance, depending on how she does in Iowa. Can he do that now? I mean, the obvious comeback is, wait a minute, you're endorsing her, but you don't think she's up for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that endorsement won't hold too much weight if he does choose to give it at this point.
Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the other candidates in this race and a kind of underlying phenomenon I wanted to discuss with you. And we talked about it before. On this show, you were one of the ones who predicted very early on that the deep state, the big money, the corporate cronies, the warmongers, obviously we know the warmongers are already with Nikki Haley, but your theory was that this cabal of sort of the elite establishment crowd were going to get behind a Democrat other than Joe Biden, that they were looking at that swing state data. They knew Joe Biden couldn't win. But Vivek Ramaswamy and others are now saying, wait a minute, the real deep state Trojan horse isn't on the Democratic side.
She's on the Republican side. Yeah, and it's interesting because obviously if you look at polls, if you look at what Republican primary voters want, there's no way that she ends up the nominee. That being said, the person who the Republicans are looking like they're going to nominate is also facing multiple very serious criminal indictments. And you and I can think what we do of the way that those were brought and the validity of the charges, but those trials are coming, and Donald Trump could very well be a convicted felon before the RNC. So it's, even if she loses the primary races, there's a strong chance that Nikki Haley could be the Republican nominee. And I don't even know what that means for our country and for our future if that happens, because I feel as though, millions of people will feel like their political will was completely discarded in the name of what people that they don't feel represent them at all want. But that's a reality.
Well, let me ask you now about the vice presidential discussion. One of the few bits of news that Donald Trump has made in Iowa over the past few days, told a town hall gathering earlier this week that he's made up his mind who he's going to pick for vice president. He has obviously not revealed that choice, but we've seen a lot of pushback from key Trump allies, Steve Bannon, his own son, Donald Trump Jr., Tucker Carlson, even Ramaswamy, all of them being very adamant that they do not want Donald Trump to choose Nikki Haley. Rand Paul just this morning came out and said he's never Nikki. So a lot of folks who are very sternly warning against Haley, either as the nominee or the vice presidential pick. Is there any universe where you see Donald Trump choosing Nikki Haley as his running mate?
Donald Trump, I could see him doing it because I think that it would be very strong for his electoral prospects. It would not be very strong for his prospects to live to see the end of his term, though.
You think you need to hire a new food taster?
I'd hire a new personal security. I wouldn't take convertible rides in Dallas. I would be a very careful man if I were him.
Yeah, she's ambition personified, really. Are you surprised that Haley is where she is in this race? Because, again, we talked for months on this show about Trump being the presumptive GOP nominee. The race
He still is.
Okay, you see, I've been calling him front runner now because I do see a potential path for her if all the dominoes fall the right way. You're saying no way.
I mean, okay, she's got a slim shot in Iowa. She has I would say, a better shot in New Hampshire. Let's talk about when she comes to her home state. How do you think that's going to play out?
Yeah.
If it even still is a race by then.
Yeah, and so many things. Obviously, this is why we're talking about Iowa, which is so important because so many things depend on the momentum coming out of Iowa and how well she performs. And, Vivek Ramaswamy's folks, they're adamant that her support is not quite as robust as it's made out to be by the mainstream press, that the surge certainly is real, but her supporters may not be quite as inclined to come out as his supporters. You buy that narrative?
I think Vivek has a lot of incentive to say that, so I don't know how seriously I take it. We're just going to have to wait and see. Unfortunately, we don't have to wait much longer.
That's right. And the caucus process, obviously, very different from a primary. This is an election where basically these folks get together in gyms and rec centers, all sorts of different local venues in the 99 counties in Iowa. And it's not, secret ballot. And it is a secret ballot at the end of it, but there's discussion. It's an argument.
Right.
It's a debate. People try to convince folks to come to one side or the other. And so it's not a primary where you walk in knowing who you're going to support, you cast your ballot, you walk out. This is one where you're actually...
You have to be committed to your candidate.
Absolutely. As you said, the talking we're almost done with. We're going to get some actual results that are not polls, that are real folks saying what they want to say. DeSantis has been saying for a long time that he's waiting for the people to speak, that he thinks the pollsters have got his downward trajectory wrong. You're not buying that either, Dylan?
I can't say that I'm buying that. And I do want to backpedal. I know we were just talking about, Iowa, Ramaswamy, he's been putting in the ground game. But the thing that has been Ramaswamy's problem this whole time is almost everybody who would vote for Ramaswamy would probably rather vote for Trump.
That's true. And you look at the candidates in this race, whether it's Ramaswamy or DeSantis, why would Trump backers need an alternative to Trump?
Well, if Trump were convicted of a felony and couldn't run. So we might be looking at Trump taken off the table, and then the GOP has to decide, do they go with MAGA or mainstream?
Boy, and that's a difficult choice.
In a very short period of time.
Very short period of time. So your prediction for South Carolina, by the time February 24 rolls around, will we still have a race, or is South Carolina at that point, is everything academic?
I think it's looking like it's going to be academic if you're going by the polls, if you're going by the fact that there are millions of individuals who have pulled the lever for Donald Trump twice in these states, who think that he did a good job as president and who'd like to see him be president again. The interesting thing is that if it's still a race by South Carolina, I don't think it will be a race after South Carolina.
Yeah, South Carolina will be high noon, in other words, potentially. Also, the other thing I have noticed, we talked about Trump and his supporters pulling that lever before, disinclined to stray from him. We have noted, looking at the Iowa polls, not only has Haley ticked up over Ron DeSantis, but Trump is at his highest level of support in those surveys as we get closer to the day of decision. Again, 53, 52, 54, depending on the survey. But the folks that supported Donald Trump are coming home to Trump in Iowa, it looks like.
It certainly does. And I think that these are people, and I think that Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis certainly got this wrong. When the Department of Justice, when Fani Willis up in New York were sicked on Donald Trump, they made a grave error politically by acting like there was legitimacy to these indictments, because I think a lot of Republican primary voters see this as an attack on themselves, which is why we saw Donald Trump go up in the polls meteorically after those indictments. And as these criminal charges escalate, these criminal charges which were designed to bring him down, he's only going up.
Yeah, it was a race at that point. In fact, DeSantis very much in striking distance, had a very clear path. But you're right, those indictments, the theory that the weaponized justice system was targeting Trump and his supporters. Trump played that deftly too. He said, they're not coming after me, they're coming after you. He really did message that very well. Dylan, we are very close. I want to thank you. You've been providing your political insights on this show for a long time.
For whatever they're worth.
Wise beyond your years, my friend, but we got to get you hooked on West Wing, man.
One of these days, Will. You know I don't got time to watch TV.
That's right. We keep you pretty busy. But Dylan Nolan, thanks for coming in on this segment with us, and we'll track these votes in Iowa and be back next week to discuss their impact. All right, folks, that is a wrap for this week's edition of the Week in Review. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Obviously, a busy week this week, but an even busier week coming next week. For starters, on Monday, we are going to drop a big interview. I teased it earlier. We sat down with Todd Rutherford. That's right, the poster politician for judicial corruption in South Carolina, a guy we've taken numerous shots at. He came into our studios to tell his side of the story. It's an interview you are not going to want to miss. That's coming Monday. The next day, Tuesday, a big live stream of a status conference that's paving the way for the evidentiary hearing on Alec Murdaugh's bid for a new trial. We're going to find out a whole lot about the status of those proceedings and how they may unfold, but you got to keep it tuned to the FITSNews live stream, which will be dropping Tuesday as that Murdaugh hearing will be held in Richland County. Keep it tuned to FITSNews. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe us. Help us get to that next level of support. But thanks again for joining us. We will catch you next time on your Week in Review.